Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, and thank you for coming to this talk. It's fantastic to see so many familiar faces and so many new friends here present in the classroom. I would also like to thank the library for the invitation and for this opportunity to give this talk as part of the exhibition Mislay Me Not, Forget Me Not, David Hawkes, and the Story of the Stone. I think this is a very, very good exhibition, and in terms of its content, in terms of its curation and aesthetics. So I would strongly recommend you, maybe after talk, to go and have a look at the exhibition yourselves. My name is Lingjie, and I'm assistant professor at the Department of Translation here at CUHK. And also I'm a research associate at the Research Center for Translation Studies, and that is also at CUHK. It's also a co-organizer or co-presenter of this exhibition at the library. So my research interests include the history of sinology, which is a traditional and a little bit old term for the study of China, for the study of everything China. So basically, in my research, I asked the question because I'm very curious to know why in the 19th century, there are so many British people who came to China, who travel long distance to come to China and to learn the Chinese language and to read and translate the Chinese literature. So in this talk, I'm going to hopefully walk you through this history with a focused case study that is the English translations of Hong Lou Meng in the 19th century. And so my title comes as the story of the stone's journey to the West, a translation history. But I have to mind you that my talk is only going to be about the Hong Lou Meng, this Chinese novel. It has nothing to do with another very good Chinese novel, 西游记, Journey to the West. So if you're expecting to know anything about 西游记, well, I'm sorry. And all I can say now is that it's still not too late to adjust your expectation a little bit. I think this is a very good title, very interesting title, and a very clever way to put the idea of how this Chinese novel travels to the West from the very beginning. But I have to admit, I have to clarify that this very interesting title is not my invention. As you can see here from the screen, that the Chinese title, 红楼梦西游记, first came in a review of David Hawkes' English translation published in the 1970s. And as you can see here, the author of this book here is signed as Lingjie, but probably you will know that this is only a pen name. This is only a pseudonym. The author's real name is Stephen Song Qi, and I hope you have heard about this name because he was a prolific translator, writer, researcher, and active promoter of the education and research of translation in Hong Kong. And he was also the founder of the Research Center for Translation here at CUHK. And also, I'm not the first and I'm not the only one to explore this history of the early English translations of Hong Lou Meng. So Professor John Minford, who actually came to Hong Kong to inaugurate this exhibition and who gave 2 talks about David Hawkes and about David Hawkes' translation just last month in Hong Kong as well. He has also written quite a lot about this history of the English translations. And he also perhaps thought this is a wonderful title to introduce this history, so adopted English translation, the story of the stone's journey to the West. So I also use this title to pay tribute to these 2 very good and very great scholars and translators. But I'm here today not to just repeat what they have said, what they have written already, but I hope I can develop this topic to give you a little bit more systematic history, a more comprehensive history, hopefully with more background information, background knowledge of all these translations, and a little bit more interpretation of all these early translations. And hopefully I would like to share with you what I thought might be a newly discovered translation of Hong Lou Meng in the 19th century. So what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to give you a contextualized history of the early English translations of the Chinese novel in the 19th century. And by contextualized, I mean, we're going to look at all these translations in its own historical background. And I'm going to do that by asking and by answering some simple questions. Who, what, why, and how. So who were these translators? What has been translated? And why they has been translated and how they has been translated in the way as they are in the 19th century. So we're going to, of course, read and appreciate some of these translations, but this talk is not only just a translation criticism, just to show you how good or bad all this translation has been in history. But I hope we can have a little bit more historical understanding of all these translations, how they come into being in the 19th century, and how nowadays we can understand the significance of these translations in history. And finally, I think it would be interesting to notice, maybe to think about the direct and indirect relations between the English translations of Hong Lou and Hong Kong. So what are these relations here? So first of all, who are these translators? So here on the screen, you can see all the names of the translators of Hong Lou that we're going to meet today, of course, through their translations. And they are what we call the sinologists. Again, this is an older term for older scholars on China, on Chinese culture, on Chinese literature. And what's special about all these people, all these guys, is that they actually came to China and stayed in China, and for some of them for a quite long period of time, for decades of years in China. And probably the first thing to notice about all these translators, sinologists, is that they are not professional translators, which means none of them managed to make a living by translating literature, which is more or less the same as literature translators nowadays. And also none of them are, well, one of them, Herbert Giles, ended up being a professor of Chinese language and literature at the Cambridge University. But apart from him, none of them were were in the academia. They were not professional scholars in academia, in universities, but they came to China for various different practical purposes, for different job opportunities, and career paths led them to China, to this very distant, very far away country and culture. And all in these institutions and from all these job opportunities, they started to learn the Chinese language and they started to read and translate Chinese literature. So here we have someone working at the East India Company, which was the monopoly that was allowed to trade with China since the 17th century. And also we have quite a lot of Protestant missionaries. And there are someone who worked at the Hong Kong colonial government. For example, John Francis Davis, he was actually the second governor of Hong Kong in the 1840s. And also we have someone working at the British consular services in China, being all these treaty ports as the result of the two opium wars in the 19th century. And also some of the sinologists and translators, they worked at the Imperial Maritime Customs in China at that time. So they are very important people, I think, in the history of the culture translation between China and Britain in the 19th century. But unfortunately, for some reason, these names and the works have still remained little known to the general public. But personally, I find the lives and works very fascinating. I hope you would do so after the talk today. So before we jump into that history and before we talk about some hopefully interesting stories about the translations, I would like to invite you maybe to take a minute to read this translation, to read this example from the first translation we're going to look at today and see how do you find this translation? Do you like this translation? Why do you think there's a translation like this in the 19th century? And if you are familiar with the Chinese novel Hong Lou, you may probably recognize immediately the story of this quotation here. So this is a translation from the chapter 4 of the story. Basically, it's about one of the characters, Xia Yuchun, who was newly appointed to to a place, and he met this old friend of his who used to be a monk at a temple where Jia Yucun also stayed for a while, and now this monk became a porter, a menzi, at this yamen, at this government office, and he's going to explain to Jia Yucun, who's newly arrived, about all these powerful families in town, including the Jia family. So there's a little bit conversation between the two characters. So how do you find this translation? Personally, when I read a translation, my first criteria would be, is it an accurate translation? And for that, I think we can take a yes for this translation. It's basically or generally accurate. It's not entirely accurate, but it can work. I mean, an English reader would understand what's going on here, the story, the plot, and what Jia Yucun means in saying this. But then the second criteria might be, how is the translation written in terms of the expression of your target language, and in this case, the English language? Then you may find the translation was written probably in a little bit strange way. Some of the expressions are not very so idiomatic in English or in an English novel. And it almost seems like a very literal translation. For example, as you can see here, that the Chinese phrase 笑道 is translated quite literally as laughing sad, which is just a little bit strange. I'm not sure, but I think it's not very commonly seen in the English novels. And by the way, if you did not notice here, that there's a lot of 笑道, there's a lot of this phrase in the Chinese novel Hong Lou Meng. There's hundreds of them. So I think it might be a very interesting research topic to see how all this 笑道 were translated effectively into English. But again, back to this translation, also some of the phrases like 岂有不作之理 is translated like, what obstacle is there to your sitting? It's quite literal, even to maybe to the extent of a word for word or character for character translation. So probably this translation may not be able to get an A in my literary translation class. But what is this literal translation? So this translation is actually an unpublished translation by Robert Morrison, dated as early as 1812. So if you know, the Chinese novel Hong Lou Meng was actually published in 1792. So that's only 20 years after publication of the Chinese novel, and we have a segment translation from the novel. That's something really remarkable for the time. And since this is an unpublished translation, it will still remain in a manuscript form. So this is a photo of the translation in the handwritten manuscript form, now stored at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS in London, in their archives. And this is the first known English translations of a segment from the Chinese novel. So then again, who was this translator? Who is Robert Morrison? And why he made this translation? Why he made this translation in this way, in this very literal way? So you may have heard about the name Robert Morrison because he is the first Protestant missionary ever came to China in 1807. But back then, it was not as glorious and it was not as glamorous as it sounds like today, because it was a very, very difficult time for him to come to China and to stay in China, simply because at that time, in the early 19th century, no foreigners were allowed to stay in China except for the purpose of trade. And they have to live in a specific area of their trading houses, and they can only live in China or live in Canton for a certain period of time over the year. And he came to China as a missionary, but again, he was not allowed to do any missionary work in China because, again, that was absolutely forbidden by the Chinese government at that time. So in order to stay in China, he had to live in Canton and in the 13 factories, the trading houses in Canton at that time, with all these foreign merchants. 在广东的13行, we may hear about this term in Chinese. And later, in order to have a legal identity, to have a legal status, to stay in China and to have a more stable life, he was appointed by the East India Company as a translator. 2 years later. So then under the protection of the East India Company, he managed to do quite a lot of missionary work, but all in secret. He translated the whole Bible into the Chinese language, and he managed to convert, to baptize at least 10 Chinese Christian believers. And he also published some or many works on China and many translations of Chinese texts, which made him an accomplished sinologist at the time. So although Morrison had never officially or personally lived in Hong Kong, he obviously left his name all over Hong Kong. So now in Hong Kong, we have the Morrison Hill in Wan Chai. We have the Morrison Street in Shangwan. They are all named after him. And also we have the Morrison Hall at the University of Hong Kong. And the Inhua College, which was formerly known as the Anglo-Chinese School, was founded by Morrison back in 1818. So then why he made this translation and why he made this translation in this way? A simple answer to that is this is a part of his work report to his boss or to his patron, to his sponsor, which is the London Missionary Society. So this translation, this manuscript translation, was included in a letter to the London Missionary Society as a proof of his language skills in Chinese. Basically, he was saying, look, I'm doing well in China. I'm working very hard on the Chinese language, and now I can read the Chinese language. I can read the Chinese text. I can provide this, produce this translation. So please send me more money, and please continue to sponsor my work and life in China. So for this very simple reason, as a clear demonstration of his language skill, I think he had to make this translation in this way, to present the translation with a very exact, with a word-for-word accuracy in this translation, to just give the translation a little bit more exotic feeling, to show the London Missionary Society that this is really a faithful representation of the Chinese text, of the way the Chinese would write in their novels, their texts. It's not just something I made up in English. And also, this manuscript translation was offered to be published in a possible second volume of his translated anthology of Chinese texts. So he had published one translation anthology of some Chinese texts, and he was aiming for another volume. But unfortunately, the second volume never came out. So this translation remained in a manuscript form. And this is no ordinary proof of your language skills, of your language proficiency, because recalling what I've just mentioned, that it was very difficult for him to stay in China. And it would be even more difficult for him to learn the Chinese language, actually, because again, the local Chinese people were forbidden to teach the Chinese language to any foreigner in China. I mean, even they cannot make very regular contacts with all these foreign residents in China at the time. And if they got caught, if they were arrested, there would be a penalty of death. So that's how hard, how difficult a foreigner can begin to learn the Chinese language, even if they're in China as well. But still, Morrison managed to find some Chinese tutors. I mean, if you pay well, there will always be someone who would want to venture in certain directions, in certain things. So he managed to find some Chinese tutors, but one interesting anecdote, one interesting story is that one of his Chinese tutor had to flee from the back door or from the back window when they heard someone knocking at the front door, because they were afraid that there's someone coming to arrest this Chinese tutor for doing this illegal thing here. So that's how difficult it is for foreigner to learn the Chinese language. So this makes this translation, I think, even more impressive, because just imagine that you have to learn Chinese, which is one of the perhaps most difficult languages in the world, with very limited resources, and you have done this all in secret. And then you can be able to not only read and write Chinese, but be able to translate one of its literary masterpieces in only 5 years after your arrival in this country. This is something that I think not everybody can do at that time in the 19th century. And this is not his, this is his first attempt to translate the Hong Lou Meng into English, but certainly not the only and not the last attempt. So because he realized how difficult it is for foreign residents to learn the Chinese language in China, he decided to help them out, to help the men just like him to learn the language by publishing several language learning materials. Some of them are listed here, the grammar book, the phrase book, the textbook, and most importantly, the dictionary. So he had published this, here this is called in one title, a dictionary of the Chinese language in 3 parts. But in fact, actually, it's 3 separate, huge volumes of dictionaries, both from English Chinese and from Chinese into English. And again, I think this is an admirable work because it's hard just to imagine all these huge dictionaries were compiled by just one man. And it's only like about 10 years after he had arrived in China. So this is the cover or title page of one of his dictionaries. And in all the 3 dictionaries, he used more than 200 sentences from Hong Lou Meng as examples or translations of some of the Chinese terms, of some of the English terms. For example, here he used this sentence as an example of the English term bustle, how to use bustle in Chinese. What does bustle mean in Chinese? And again, if you read English translation, it's very literal translation. 吃饭 in Chinese, it translates character for character as eating rice. I mean, it's not accurate translation, but that's the way you work with a dictionary because the semantic accuracy is not the most important thing. It's not the primary concern. What's more important is the exact equivalence between the Chinese characters and English words. So the foreign student can understand, they can recognize, and then they can link all these English words and Chinese characters. That's how they learn the Chinese language, character by character. And there's longer segments of the translation of Hong Lou Meng in this book, which is called, again, this is a typical 19th century book, which has a very long title that aims to tell you everything about this book. So this book is called Dialogue and Detached Sentences in the Chinese Language with a free and verbal translation in English. And also it tells you the function, the purpose of this book is it is designed as an initiatory work for the use of students of Chinese. And in this book, he translated segments from this chapter of the Chinese novel. It has a very interesting layout, a design of the book. As you can see here, that all the Chinese characters were printed horizontally in the middle, and you have a romanization of each and every Chinese character on the left, and then you have a character for character translation into English on the right. But then you have a free translation at the beginning for each Chinese sentence at the very beginning. But if you read this free translation, it is still very literal. It's just very slightly revised and slightly polished translation from all the following character for character translation after that. So again, obviously, there's no consideration of the literary value, of the literary merit of this Chinese novel. And it's all about the linguistic equivalence here. And this is typical for a language textbook here. So this is the first sinologist, this is the first translator who had tried to translate this Chinese novel into English, but for very practical purpose of language learning. And he was not only one to do so, and we have 2 more sinologists who shared his mission here. So our second sinologist, our second translator is called Robert Tam, or in Chinese, his Chinese name is Luo Bodan. So he came to China to work at the Jardin and Matheson, the Yihe Yanghang in Canton at first, where he started to learn the Chinese language. But then he come to serve at the British Armed Forces during the First Opium War. And this not because he was a very good soldier or he was a very good general, but because of his superb command of the Chinese language. Because during the First Opium War, there's not so many British people who can read the Chinese language, and there's even few who is as good as he was at the time. And then after war, he served as the British consul in Ningbo, one of the newly opened treaty ports, because of the Opium War. And actually, he did not just serve at this forced army during the First Opium War, but he was one of the translators and interpreters involved in the negotiation and signing of the Treaty of Nanking, which somehow we can say maybe decided destiny of Hong Kong later on. So this is a picture of the signing, the site, the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. And actually, he was no ordinary helper, assistant in the process. Look how he was able to get to sit at the table with all these high-ranking Chinese Mandarin officials at the center of all this group of generals and important figures. So which indicates how important he was to the whole process and in this historical moment. And just a very quick word for the other two translators, interpreters. John Morrison, make a guess, is the son of Robert Morrison. And Charles Guzlov is also another very, very interesting figure in history. The one thing he has done about Hong Lou Meng is he published a very short introduction or introductory essay about this Chinese novel Hong Lou Meng, but he made some very terrible mistakes. For example, he has mistaken one of the protagonists, Jia Baoyu, as a girl. And he translated Ling Daiyu, the name, into Black Jade. So something not so nice in the English language. So although he was also considered somehow as a sinologist in the 19th century, but at least his introduction to Hong Lou Meng, well, remained as some kind of a joke in history, unfortunately for him. And in addition to being very active in all these historical events, political events, Robert Tom also published some translations and some works on Chinese language and Chinese culture. So he had actually published a Chinese translation of Aesop's fables, 伊索寓言. So you can probably tell how good his Chinese language is, his Chinese skill is. And also in one of his publications, the Chinese speaker or extracts from works written in the Mandarin language. This is the title page of this book. And many of the examples in this book were actually selected and translated from another Chinese book here. So in this book, he translated a longer section of the novel from chapter 6 of the novel, and it was included in the appendix of this kind of textbook of the Chinese language. So he has the English translation, the Romanization of the Chinese characters printed on one page, and the Chinese original text printed on another page. So again, we can have a look at his translation and see how is it. How is the translation? So Zhuri's wife tried to recognize her for a long time and at length said with a smile, "What, oh goody Liu, how are you well?" and so on. So this is a conversation between Zhou Rui and Liu Laolao. We know the story behind. But if you can quickly read through the translation, you may also tell that, again, this is a quite literal translation here. Again, we can test that with the phrase, which is mentioned, the xiao dao. So it was still, again, translated as smiling sad. Or some phrases like 你说 is very faithfully contained and translated as you may indeed say, something like this. But if you can notice here, you can spot here, we start to see some of the literary concerns in the translation, because one of the verbs, one of the character in Chinese, 一面走一面说笑道, this 走 is not translated like literally or as working or as worked, but it was translated as a trashed. A way of working with heavy steps, a specific way of working that's very appropriate for a character of an old age as Liu Laolao. So I would say this is a very literary translation of this character and of this expression. And perhaps another interesting to notice, if we have seen like 3 separate translations so far, and if you have noticed the content, the plot, the characters that both Robert Morrison and Robert Tong had selected to translate, who are they? They are Jia Yucun and the monk or the porter. They are Xi Ren the maid, and they are Liu Laolao the granny. They are all ordinary working people. And not all these other main characters, not the girls and boys in the Daguanyuan, not all the aristocratic family, right? So this makes me wonder if the two translators, Robert Morrison and Robert Tom, the choices of the source text would suggest or imply somehow that their interest or their concern is more about the language and life and the way of living of all these ordinary Chinese people instead of the elites. Because if you want to teach the Chinese language to all the foreign residents, more likely all these foreign residents will have in contact with all these ordinary people in the street. You want to buy something, you want to communicate with your servants, rather than with all the elite people, with all these ladies living their whole life maybe in a confined garden here. So that's a very interesting choice of the source text. And another sinologist, another translator is Joseph Atkins, whose Chinese name is Ai Yue Se. He was also a Protestant missionary active in Beijing and in Shanghai. He was also a very important scholar on the Chinese language and religion. But in modern Chinese history, he was probably better known as a translator of the Western knowledge, of the Western scientific works into Chinese to bring all the new knowledge from the West to China in collaboration with some Chinese translators. And like Morrison and Tom, he was also a man with some unusual experience and evolved in some historical moments. In 1860, he actually made some visits to the Taiping Rebellion, the rulers, Taiping Tianguo, because he wanted to determine the precise nature of their beliefs, because we all know the Taiping Tianguo, the Taiping Rebellion, they worship the god as well. 他们也是拜上帝. So is this God the same as ours? Are they the real Christians? Can we work them to convert the whole nation of China into Christianity? And also in 1880, somehow he resigned from the missionary work, which is kind of unusual for a missionary, and joined the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customers. And he was a renowned scholar on Chinese language and religion, and he published quite a lot on these topics, especially on Chinese language. And you can probably tell from some of the titles of his publications that he had this very interesting, very singular, and very original theory or idea that he tries to show that the Chinese and European languages have a common origin. And even he had this theory that the Chinese people originated from the West, from the Middle East, and they immigrated to China thousands of years ago. I mean, whether this is scientific observation, research, or whether this is just a wild imagination, I think there's an underlying belief that as a missionary, he wanted to believe there's a common nature to all human beings, like we are all brothers and sisters, we are all the children of the God, somehow to justify the religion, Christianity, and to justify his missionary work in China. So that's a very interesting thing about him. And in one of his less theoretical publications, A Grammar of Colloquial Chinese, he translated parts of chapter 98 from the Chinese novel, and it was printed in this interlinear way with the Chinese original sentence followed by an English translation. And finally, we meet the two main characters of the novel, Bao Yu and Dai Yu. So again, if you would like to take a minute to quickly read the translation, or probably I can read very quickly for you. So here, Bao Yu, on hearing it, could not restrain himself, but wept aloud. He threw himself on the bed, when suddenly before his eyes all became pitch black. His mind was stirred by restless thoughts. He saw before him what appeared to be a man approaching. Bao Yu hurried to ask him, I beg to ask what place this is. The man replied, this is the way to 9 fountains, where resides the ruler of Hades. Your term of life is not completed, so why have you come here? Bao Yu replied, I've heard that when anyone has died, this is the place to seek for him, and I have missed my way. The man asked, who is the departed one? But we answered, Lin Daiyu of Suzhou. And the man laughed sardonically and said, Lin Daiyu and yourself could not be united as men, and nor can you as a ghost. So just by reading this translation, you may probably find that finally we do not have a very literal translation. We have a very fluent, very well-written English translation here of the Chinese novel. And you can see the English is very dramatic. There are some literary expressions, for example, even in the first sentence, something like he threw himself on the bed. This is something that you might be able to read in a modern English novel nowadays. And again, let's test again with the 笑道, with the phrase 笑道, 冷笑道. Finally, it's not something like cold love being said. It's an adverb is used here to translate, to give idea of the emotion of the expression here. And also there's a consideration of the culture elements, of the culture specific items. 阴司泉路 is the land of the dead in Chinese. And we can see here, this is very considerate, this is a very careful translation. First with a literal translation of the 9 fountains, the 9泉. And then it was followed by something that might be more familiar to the English readers. It's a substitution with an English term, with an English reference to the ruler of the Hades. So although this translation is still included in the work on the Chinese literature, we start to see the indications of some literary concern in the translation. So far we have met 3 translators, and we may quickly recap here that one of the most important purposes and functions of translating Hong Lou Meng in the 19th century is for this novel, for the sentences, for the segments, to be used as examples in language learning materials. So the translation will usually made in certain ways, and usually it's a very literal translation. And this fact also tells us something about how these foreign residents in China in the 19th century get to learn the Chinese language at the first place. So apparently, novel reading was considered as a very effective approach in acquiring the Chinese language because of its vernacular and colloquial expressions. So in the same book by Robert Morrison, The Dialogue and Detached Sentences, there's a very interesting mock dialogue in the book between a student of the Chinese, presumably a foreign student of the Chinese, and his Chinese tutors. And yes, it's always his Chinese tutors, because most of the foreign residents in China in the 19th century are men and white men. So that's the thing. So in this mock dialogue, but I think it must be based on some real conversation, probably between Robert Morrison and one of his Chinese tutors. So the foreign student asked the teacher that I would like to learn Chinese language. What book should I read? And the tutor replied that you should read the 大学, one of the Confucian classics first. But I'm afraid it's too hard for you because you're only the beginner in the Chinese language. So then Hong Lou Meng would also be a very good choice here. And then the student said, I've never seen this book. Have you seen it? And the tutor replied, I don't have it with me, but if you want to have a look, I will have someone send it for you. So I would take this as some very interesting historical evidence of the popularity of this Chinese novel Hong Lou Meng as a must-read for the foreign students of the Chinese language in the 19th century, or in the early 19th century. But this is a practice throughout the 19th century, even towards the second half or towards the late 19th century. As another very important sinologist tells us, so Herbert Giles, whose Chinese name is Zhai Li, maybe you have heard his name somehow, because he was obviously one of the most important sinologists in the 19th century and an expert on Chinese literature. So in one of his memoirs, he recollected how he had started to learn the Chinese language as early as in 1868. So one thing he has done is to read a lot of Chinese novels, including this famous and splendid novel known as The Dream of the Red Chamber. But what's more interesting in his memoir and is that I find he's a very honest man, honest enough to admit that this novel is very, very hard for him to cope with. So as you can see here that he said, I've made 3 attempts to read the novel, to work through, getting a little bit further at each attempt, but it was only in 1884, like almost 20 years after he first started to read a Chinese novel, he managed to read it from the beginning to the end. So if you find the Chinese novel Hong Lou Meng is very difficult and you cannot finish it, don't panic. You are not the only one in the world to think that like this. So even for established sinologists, Herbert Giles would find this translation very difficult to read through and to understand, so let alone to translate. So is it possible really to translate this novel as a literary work in the 19th century? So some sinologists has expressed the same concern. They've asked the same question, and precisely because they have realized, they have understood difficulty, the literary merit, and the significance of this Chinese novel. So they find that it must be very, very difficult for a foreign reader to translate as a whole, to give a full translation, or even it is impossible for them to give a full translation of this Chinese novel. So here, another very important sinologist, William Frederick Mayers. First, he acknowledged that in China, the work is more universally popular than this. But then he observed that so far, no European has yet had the courage to attempt a translation, which means a full translation of this novel. So the length of the novel, the numerous characters and their names would be formidable obstacles for any translator to overcome. And there's another sinologist, Alfred Lister, who shared the same opinion. Who believes that the length and the number of the persons to characters, and also some of the mysterious clause or conversations there would make this translation a very, very, very difficult work to do. It's a hard nut to crack. But one thing I do admire about all these sinologists that they are all very, very brave people, and they were never afraid to venture to take up this challenge. So yes, there has been some sinologists, there has been some translators to make the effort to crack this very hard nut, to translate part of Hong Lou Meng as a literary work. So our first translator is John Francis Davis, who started to learn the Chinese language as a writer at the East India Company. And then who was also deeply involved in some political events in the 19th century, who joined the unsuccessful Lord Amherst mission to Beijing, but they never get to Beijing and never get to meet the emperor of the Qing dynasty. But then later on, as you probably still remember, I mentioned that he became the second governor of Hong Kong from 1944 to 1848. And so obviously he also left his name in Hong Kong. So nowadays we have the Davis Street, which is named after him in Kennedy Town. So in history, he was not a very favorable government in Hong Kong, but he was definitely a very successful translator and sinologist, especially of Chinese literature. So he had published quite many, here at least 4 of his translations of some Chinese plays, the Yuanjiaju, or some short stories from Li Yu's 12楼, or the novel, the single one most popular novel in Europe at the time, the 好球传, a full translation of this novel. And you may have noticed that the year of 1829 is a particularly busy year for him, that in that year, he not alone published 2 translations of literary works, but he also published one of the most important works on Chinese poetry in the 19th century. This book is called On the Poetry of the Chinese. This is a comprehensive survey of the Chinese poetic art, describing and expanding all the techniques, the features, the history, and the styles of all different Chinese poetry. And some critic later on commented that whatever idea the English-speaking peoples entertained on the subject of Chinese poetry were largely derived from this particular work. So you may see how important it is. So in this book, John Francis Davis has made the first serious attempt to translate but just one verse from Hong Lou Meng into English. And this translation is made in 1829. So again, very, very early. And again, if you're familiar with the Chinese novel Hong Lou Meng, you may immediately recognize that this is a verse describing one of our protagonists, Jia Baoyu. So basically, it's not a very good description of him. And basically, the Chinese original is saying that he's useless in various different ways. So how is this translation? Before this translation, Davis gave us a very brief introduction or description of this poem, saying that this quotation is from a novel called The Dreams of the Red Chamber, and it's a poetic account of a young Chinese profligate, 一个浪荡子, which is a very appropriate description of Jia Baoyu here. And he also rightly pointed out that the Chinese original is not a regular poem, but it's a lyric poem. It's a lyric verse. 是一首词, 不是一首诗. So it's a very irregular species of the verse in 6 and 7 words. And he also very modestly described his translation, that he thought his translation is nothing serious, nothing wonderful, extraordinary, but it's only a line by line, it's a word for word translation, and it pretends to be to nothing more than just a very close adherence to the sense, which is to the meaning of the original, but which implies that he does not pay any attention to all the formal features of the Chinese original. But is that the case? Again, you may have a very quick look at his translations here. So we read the translation from we read the original Chinese text from the right to the left, as in the traditional Chinese way. And here's the corresponding English translation from him. So I just read maybe the first 4 lines of the Chinese original text. The path of travel heedlessly he braves. Now shines a wheat, and now a madman raves. His outward form of nature's bounty dressed. Foul weeds usurped the wilderness his breast. Even by reading these 4 lines, you may immediately tell that this translator, John Francis Davis, actually paid much attention to the poetic features of the Chinese original and put all this poetic things in his translation as well. The translation rhyme by the couplets, by the 2 lines, braves and raves. And there's a meter. He actually used one of the most popular kind of meter, the iambic pentameter, 五步一阳格, which is a favorite of William Shakespeare here. So the path of travel heedlessly he braves. It reads like that. And also there's a lot of poetic diction. And also the sentence structures, we find a lot of inverted sentences here. So the path of travel heedlessly he braves. So it should be, he braves heedlessly the path of travel. Or the titles and wealth to him no joy impart. So it should be the titles and wealth impart no joys to him. And there's even an attempt to the parallel sentence structure to kind of imitate the parallel structure of the Chinese original. In Chinese original or in Chinese poetry, we use a lot of the 对仗 structure. So here he had this parallel structure, or wretch to flee the good, thy fate intends. Also the use of the poetic thy, or hopeless to thy country and thy friends. So overall, we can say that this is just more than adherence to the sense of the Chinese original, but also a very poetic and literary translation in an attempt to show the literary value, the literary merit of the original. And if we compare his translation with David Hawkes' translation, a very modern translation here, we can probably tell that the 2 translators actually traveled in the same or very similar path or direction in their way of translation. So David Hawkes' translation also rhymes with the couplets. And somehow there's a coincidence that for some lines, they both decided to put a pause, a very short pause, a break in the middle of the line, in these two lines. You can see here very clearly. So we can conclude here that this is really the first very serious attempt to translate part of the Hong Lou Meng as a literary text. And an even more impressive attempt was made somehow about 40 years later after John Francis Davis by a sinologist and translator named Edward Charles Borah, whose Chinese name is Bao Lan. He unfortunately lived a very short life. He died at the age of 32, 33. But he really had a very full and very colorful life of himself. Before he came to China, he actually went to Italy in 1860 to join the British Legion of the Garibaldi, the Red Shirts Army, to fight for the unity of Italy. Not sure if you are familiar with this piece of history. 加里波第的红衫军是为了那个意大利的统一有这样一场战争。So as a British man, he went to Italy and fight this whatever he thought righteous were here. And then he came to China as a student interpreter, where he started to learn the Chinese language. And then after 2 years, he joined the Imperial Maritime Customers in Ningbo. But apparently, he showed his talent in learning the Chinese language. As you can see that in the same year, and only after 2 years, he had started to learn the Chinese language. He was noticed and then selected to organize and to later on accompany some high-ranked Chinese officials for their tour, for this grand tour to Europe in 1866. And then about 6 years later, he was also chosen to help to organize the Chinese contribution, the Chinese participation in the Vienna International Exhibition. So you can tell that there must be something in him that would be able to have been trusted by the Chinese government to take part in all those very important events here. But unfortunately, like I said, he died young, and he obviously had a very busy life of all this administrative affairs, that he did not leave us with many publications. And almost all his publications are just articles and translations published on periodicals. The things published on periodicals, they are very difficult to be preserved and to be found and located by later generations of sinologists or of scholars. So many of his works, many of the articles and translations still remained unnoticed in all these periodicals. But he was fortunately noticed, and he was fortunately remembered as the translator for his excellent translation of the first 8 chapters of the Hong Lou Meng. And it was published in a periodical called the China Magazine. So this magazine was published in Hong Kong, but it was also distributed in Shanghai, London, and Paris. So a very international journal, and with a very international audience and readers here. So although the journal is titled the China Magazine, and there's a lot of things published about China, some translations of Chinese novels and Chinese poetry, it's not simply a journal for the sinologists. It's not very scholarly in this way, but it was just a leisure reading for all the foreign residents and for those in London and Paris who are interested in China to read some of the creative writings and read translations like this related to China. And his translation was published in 1868 in this journal. And this translation is significant in 2 ways, because the translation also comes with a very short article, an introductory essay explaining what is Hong Lou Meng, why it is important, why it is very good, and why you should read an English translation of this Chinese novel. And this is the first time, or before, that the Chinese novel, the Hong Lou Meng, was only mentioned as a great masterpiece, literary masterpiece, one of the best Chinese novels, but only in China. So here, this is the first time that this Chinese novel was positioned in the realm of world literature. it was mentioned, it was discussed in comparison to some very well-known and very important Victorian English novelists, such as Thackeray, who wrote Vanity Fair. And the author of this is a quotation. This might not be the author of this essay, but the quotation of these two passages from, again, the Mayers, William Frederick Mayers, that he thought the Hong Lou Meng is comparable to all these great Victorian novels in terms of the ways that all these characters, the complexity of all these characters were described, and all the intricate family relations, the passions, the falls in this novel. So it's just as great as two masterpieces of English romance, of English novels. And Professor John Minford especially is a huge fan of this translation. So he mentioned in various occasions that the translation is astonishingly good for its date, for the mid-19th century. And the translation is accurate, it's stylish, it's eloquent, it's witty, and does not shy away from the many inherent difficulties of the text. For example, all the poetries and all the cultural references and all the very mysterious parts in the first chapter, if you can still remember, all this 空空道人, something like 茫茫和尚, or something like this, and all this very abstract discussion of Chinese philosophy there. So he had translated all these contents in his translation. And when I mentioned to Professor John Minford that I'm going to give a talk on the history of English translations of Hong Lou Meng in the 19th century, so apart from saying, well, that's very good, go ahead, do this talk, the one specific thing he had told me is that please talk about Edward Borah and his translation. So here I am talking about Borah's translation to you. So let's see just how good this translation is. I think the best way to really understand how good this translation is of course to read through the translation, which we don't have the time to do this. I'm going to again share with you the translation of some of the poems from the Chinese novel. So you might be maybe you have not read this Chinese novel, but maybe you are familiar with these few lines explaining what really is its Hong Lou Meng, what's the significance of the Hong Lou Meng here. So it's like a gist of the whole novel, of the whole story. So let's see how Borah had translated and put this in English. One falls from out the formless void, creation first gave shape to earth. Who was the gift to passion's seeds, their die for origin and birth? The wooing breeze, the glowing moon, their influence in one combined, propitious moments made, and their intensest passion's source we find, of hopes, resources, or bereft, in days of grave and sad distress, in hours of silent solitude. My simple thoughts I'd fain express, and therefore now I would rehearse this song of the red chamber stream, where morning gold, despairing jade, provide me with a fitting theme. So again, this like Davis's translation, this is a very poetic translation written in the English language. Again, it rhymes. It considers the meta, also the iambic pentameter is used here. There's the inverted sentence structure, the line for some lines. There's the use of some poetic diction here. It's poetic, but not overly poetic, like in the case of Davis's translation. It's still a very fluent, easy to understand translation here at the of the translation. So these translation, again, it pays much attention to the literary merit and the literary value of the Chinese original and put them very appropriately and very suitably into the English language. And another thing that Edward Borah, E.C. Borah has done is that he actually distinguished the different styles of all the different Chinese poems in this novel. We all know there's all different kinds of poems in the Chinese novel. Some are a little bit more poetic and complicated and difficult to understand. And some, like this one, I think you are all familiar with this very long poem. The 好了歌, this is actually written in a very simple and a very direct way. So you can probably tell from Borah's translation here that he actually used the different English styles to translate different poems. So in this translation, the expression, the English expression, the diction, the lines are even shorter to give the idea of this simple, this very direct style of a dowager. 有一点像一个打油诗 this kind of style in the English translation. And then immediately in the next translation, explanation, a more poetic and more complicated, a more kind of elegant version of the previous poem. You can see the translation also varies. Long lines, very long lines, and then complicated and more poetic, more elegant, and more difficult words were used in this translation. So this is another thing, a very difficult thing to do for a translator to vary your translation styles of the Chinese source text. And the final thing that is special about this translation is that this is not only a literary translation of the novel, but it's also somehow a scholarly work. From all these notes, all these some of very long notes made by Yixi Bora here. Like here, he listed all the solar terms, the Chinese 节气, the 24 solar terms here, and translating them out. It's not really necessary for your understanding of the Chinese novel, of the story, of the plots, but it shows the endeavors of a scholar, of a sinologist in his translation. So many of the translations in the 19th century, we cannot simply understand them as a literary translation, but they are also scholarly works, the research at the same time. Even though only 8 chapters were translated by Yixi Bora, all the genius and all this effort put in the translation have made it for a very long time the best translation of this novel in 19th century and even in early 20th century. And finally, we have to also mention this man, Henry Bancroft Jolly, whose Chinese name is Zhou Li, who worked at the British Consular Service as well in Macau and in Korea. But also, unfortunately, he died quite young in Korea because of poor health. And we have to mention him because he made this tremendous effort to translate the first 56 chapters. I think he could make more, but just unfortunately, he died young there, and the translations were published in 1892. I identified this translation. I put this translation in the category of literary translation because, as you can tell from the title page, this is said it's a Chinese novel. There's nothing about language learning, like in the works by Morrison or Robert Tong. But in this very short preface, in the very short introduction by the translator himself, again, he was very modest, explaining the reason why he would want to make this translation. This is because his experience of learning the Chinese language by reading this Chinese novel. And then he again made this very modest claim that there are many shortcomings with my translation, and it does not pretend to be something very good, but I would be satisfied if it can offer a helping hand to the foreign students of Chinese language. I would be very happy with that. And I think this is maybe the quite accurate description of his translation here, because let's also read his translation of the poem we've just read, and maybe compare a little bit with Bora's translation. And you may find, again, this is really a little bit also literal and simplified translation of the Chinese text. All the very poetic expression in the Chinese was simply put in a very plain and a very simple way. So I wouldn't say this is a very literal or very good in the sense of literary translation, but still we may give him a round of applause for making this effort of translating almost half of the Chinese novel. And finally, I think with all these previous translations we have just read, there's an implied purpose or function for all these translations, that from translating this Chinese novel or from reading the translation of this Chinese novel, the foreign readers may have the chance to know a little bit more about the Chinese society and the Chinese way of living. So even with Morrison's unpublished translation, he also mentioned that this translation could provide a faithful picture of the state of society in China. And this purpose was more explicitly expressed in this translation that I think you may check after this course, but I think no one has ever talked about this ever of this history of this translation. Probably because the translation was titled. The title has nothing to do with 红楼梦. It's titled "The Chinese School Life." You may think this is a description of a school life in the Chinese school, and it was published in a newspaper that is called the North China Herald, published in Shanghai in English. And the translator did not sign his name to the translation. So now I have no idea who the translation is. I can make some guess, but I have to verify a little bit further after that. So again, but the translator gave a very short, again, introduction to the novel and to his translation. He also mentioned that this novel is a noble and a beautiful piece of work in Chinese. And I have freely translated as much of it as will give the reader a glimpse of the Chinese school life and of the scene in a Chinese classroom. So with this reference, you may guess that the translation is actually from chapter 7 and chapter 9 from the Chinese novel, where a description of a very lively scene of a fight in a private school of the Jia family. So it's a very long translation. It runs like a few thousand of words. But just like the translator mentioned, this is not a literary translation, and he only gave a basic idea of the story of what's going on here. As you can probably tell from this example, that all this detailed description of the fight was simplified in the translation as some of the boys had got up on the top of the table, roaring, yelling, and clapping their hands, and that's it. That's the way this translator put the Chinese story into English. But I think it's a very interesting translation to take notice and maybe to do a little bit of research on that as well. So we have surveyed today all the English translations published in the 19th century of the Chinese novel 红楼梦. And what I like to share with you is that we see all these different translations and different ways they were made in the 19th century. And I hope you could have a little bit more sophisticated idea or understanding of the complexity of translation, that a literary work might not be always translated as a literary translation. So a literary work can be translated in a very practical way, for example, for the purpose of learning the language. And so the translator may have their specific purposes for the translation. And I think it would be better if we criticize their translation according to their purposes. So I don't think it makes much sense that if you say, oh, this is a ridiculous translation, that you translate 笑道 into laughing sad or smiling sad, because that's just the way the translator wanted this to be exact correspondence with the Chinese characters. So, and this is especially true with the translations in history, because we have to understand the background knowledge. We have to understand the purpose of these translations before we can give a very fair and a very just evaluation of that translation. And I also hope this talk could give you a glimpse of the history of sinology. So I hope you know what is sinology and what happened and who were these translators and what have they done in history. So I would like to share with you a little bit, why am I interested in all these sinologists in the 19th century, some white men 200 years ago. So in modern Chinese history, all these persons, the missionaries, they were kind of labeled very often as the foreign devils or as the colonists, as the imperialists, who came to China to steal something, to rob something, or to rule the people. I'm not going to comment on that, but what has attracted my attention at the first place is their extraordinary life experience and their works. Because just imagine, even nowadays, we might not be able to accommodate to a new environment. For example, if you're going to immigrant to the UK next month, you might be nervous a little bit, even if we know the language very well, even if we've tasted their food, even if we know the culture quite well, still we cannot immediately get used to the new way of living. But imagine all these people who I think were very brave, very enterprising, and very tough, who would be able to sail on the sea for several months, for at least 3 to 6 months, to be able to travel to China. And then they not only survived in China, survived all this very different climate and very different way of living, but they managed to produce something that might be able to enhance the foreign readers' knowledge about China, and maybe to help a little bit with the mutual culture communication between China and between the West. And this is the achievement that I would like to respect and I would like to admire for them. But of course, I'm not saying that all these translators are all saints and they're all very good. They're very good guys. In my research, I have met dozens of these sinologists, and they are all very different. I've met someone who's really deeply influenced by all these thinkings of colonialism and imperialism, and they were really mean, believe me, they were really mean and arrogant, and they dismissed everything Chinese as inferior to their European counterparts. But there are also many others I find who are really intelligent and curious and impartial, and most importantly, sympathetic, just as we are today towards a different and other cultures, and who have taken the study of Chinese things, Chinese language, Chinese literature sincerely and seriously. And they want to give an authentic and a real representation of China and of everything Chinese and a kind of knowledge to the foreign readers. And they send the message, I can read from their works, they want to send this message that the Chinese people, though they look very different, they live in a very different way from us, from the Europeans, but still there's a universal human nature in these people as well. There's the same human heart beating in their chests as well. So the Chinese people, they're not barbarians. They have all this remarkable culture, civilization. They have this remarkable literature, such as Hong Lou Meng. Just as we have Thackeray or Jane Austen in English as well. So this idea and this way of thinking, I think, is a view that defines Eurocentrism, which is very much ahead of its time, actually, in the 19th century, if not still ahead of our time as well. So, of course, we can't condemn the acts of colonialism and imperialism, but still, I think I always wonder, can we put all those labels to each and every individuals just involved in that history? Can we put that label, regardless of everything, and put all this label to all the sinologists? And to what extent and in what sense can we say yes or no to that question? So I hope from their very sympathetic understanding of China, we can also learn a little bit of something about the cross-culture communication and understanding. And also, I think this case study of the English translations of Hong Lou Meng also tells us a little bit more about the history of China's encounter with the West in the 19th century, because in the 19th century is usually depicted as a century of humiliation. Again, in modern Chinese history, it's a century of political and military failure, and it's a century about evasion and all these unequal treaties. But under this very ground narrative of a nation's fate, I hope we can start to notice there's always been more concrete, more humane contacts between the peoples and between the cultures, and some of them are through the literature. So this potentially more promising cultural context and the sinologist pioneering effort in this aspect has unfortunately been unnoticed and neglected to a certain extent so far. So I think it's time that we recognize and even to order those who have devoted their time and effort and even their lives studying and translating the Chinese literature. And just a very quick final word, I think it would be interesting to think about and to notice all these direct and indirect relations between the English translations of Hong Lou Meng and Hong Kong. So we see the indirect relations, like maybe from Morrison, who had his legacies in Hong Kong, or from Robert Tom, who kind of, in a sense, decided the destiny of Hong Kong there. But we also have more direct relations, like Davis being the first governor of Hong Kong, and the journal And many journals like this, the China magazine, they were actually published in Hong Kong in the 19th century, which kind of performed as a center for all the studies of China, of Chinese literature, of Chinese culture, to be published and shared from Hong Kong. So from this focused study of translation history, I hope we could notice and even celebrate the significance of Hong Kong as the locale and the channel that connects the East and the West and the traditional and the modern. That will be the end for my presentation today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Chi. And thank you very much. This is very interesting and passive sharing. I'm particularly interested in the linkage between Hong Kong and also the major translators. So it's very happy to hear that. So now it's the Q&A section, and we welcome any questions about the contents of this talk. And may I ask if any questions from the floor? Any questions? You know, I have one question actually. Okay. So we always heard that David Hawkes' version is the most outstanding version of the translation about the story of the stone. So what do you think about what makes this version distinguished from other versions that you have mentioned about? What is the, you know, the major characteristics of the David Hawkes version?
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you very much. So first thing, I think we all agree that David Hawkes' translation is much better than any of the translation I've discussed today, right? They are all like just historical. They may have some the values as we can learn a little bit of the translation strategies from all these 19th century translations, but basically they are a little bit out of date. And David Hawkes' translation is, I guess so far, is, for one thing, it's a full translation. It's a complete translation. There's no word missing or simplified in his translation. There's just a little bit, a lot more added in his translation to expanding some of the Chinese cultural terms or some very difficult parts. And that's something I don't think many other translators could have done in history. So this is a very comprehensive translation, and it's a very literary translation. The English translation is very well and very carefully written. I'm not an expert in David Hawkes' translation, and if you have ever attended one of Zhong Mingfei's talks, he had talked a lot about what is very good about David Hawkes' translation. For example, David Hawkes has actually embedded many of the references to English literature in his translation. So he used many of the references, and not all those commonly known and universally seen references in English literature, some of the and use them to translate some of the Chinese terms. For example, one example I could remember from Professor Zhong Mingfei's talks is that at the very beginning, this precious jade, 那个宝玉, is found in the 青埂峰. Even for the Chinese readers, we would just read, oh, this is the name of this peak or of this hill. If I would like to translate that, I would just use maybe the romanization of this name into something like 青埂峰. That's it. But David Hawkes has done a little bit of research, or maybe he had his interpretation and understanding that nothing in Hong Meng is meaningless. I mean, he probably thought that the author, Cao Xueqing, presumably Cao Xueqing, would not put a lot of extra meaning to the text. So in this case, the 青埂峰 is actually also it's a word for 情根, so the root of love in Chinese as well. They are basically the same sound of these two words. So in order to also give this extra layer of the meaning of something related to love, which is the theme of this novel, he translated this term 青埂峰 into something like green sickness. But again, what is green sickness? Modern readers may not be able to recognize this term immediately, but even for Professor Zhong Mingfei, so I think he mentioned that he had done some research and find that green sickness is a reference also to love, to a sickness in love. If you are a young girl and you fall in love with someone, the unfinished or unaccomplished love, it's something called green sickness. It's a little bit archaic, it's a little bit traditional and outdated term, but this sense of being archaic is perfectly for a novel like Hong Lou Meng. So this would make a perfect translation, and translation not many people could think of to put in the translation. So that's something extraordinary and remarkable about David Hawkes' translation. And again, I'm not an expert on David Hawkes' translation. I would again strongly recommend you to watching one of Professor Zhong Meifer's talks on this translation, and many of them are online on YouTube. So you can easily find all these talks and to explore how good is David Hawkes' translation. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you, Lingjie, for your wonderful presentation. So I think it's very comprehensive introduction about like different versions of Hong Lou Meng. So on my own curiosity, because you presented each of the versions in a unique way. So like from the translation studies perspective, when there's a practice of retranslation, the question that I would ask is that is there any referential effects between different versions, or when one source text being translated like more than once, right? I would guess that maybe the second or even the third translators, maybe they will borrow something, or will they take the previous versions as reference, or is there any connection between these different versions?
Thank you. Thank you for your question, and that is actually something I would want to put in my presentation, but as you can see, I'm already running out of time, so I didn't really mention in this talk. The answer is definitely yes. Because all these sinologists, they're just this group of people, they have their kind of tradition or even community. They communicate even in different ages, in different time periods, they communicate through all their words. So the late generation of the translators would definitely read something by Robert Morrison or by June Frost Davis. So they must have read some of their translations, or when they first learn the Chinese language, they may read one of their textbooks that contains the translation of the Hong Lou Meng. And I didn't really compare all their translations, the text there, but we can find some reference here. Especially, I would want to share with you, but I don't have the time, that this Ingvor's translation, in one of his notes actually mentioned that the name of Liu Laobao, Granny Liu, he also translated as Gudi Liu, which he mentioned that was suggested by the translator, to the translator by Robert Tom's translation of a previous version. So obviously there's a reference. I think there's some more reference here. I think Bora mentioned somewhere that some of the translations of some of his poems is with the help of Mayers. So Mayers is actually, I think, a very neglected figure in the history of sinology. He was actually regarded as one of the mentors, the very influential figure in the knowledge of Chinese culture and Chinese literature. So Bora actually was kind of a student to Mayers here. So he also mentioned that I got help from Mayers for some of my translations of some of the poems. And I'm not sure, I think Giles would have read all these previous translations and some of the works by the sinologists. And again, I didn't really compare all this text or maybe read through very carefully all these translations, but I'm sure there will be cross-references, so even maybe they borrow the translation of previous translations. I think there might be another case, but somehow it's maybe Bora or it's maybe Jolly who actually borrowed translation of some points entirely and put it into his own translation, but I cannot find it now. Sorry.
So any questions on the floor?
Thank you very much, Professor Ji, for your fantastic presentation. I think many of your inferences and argumentations are pretty convincing and make perfect sense. I personally take your research as part of translation history.
Yes.
Maybe at the intersection between translation history and sinology. So I was wondering, what is your methodology in doing this kind of research, because you didn't mention it. And is it some kind of archival method in doing history, or the descriptive approach in translation? Thank
Yes,
you.
I think you have just mentioned the two key words of my methodology, which is historical. I do all this, I kind of regard all this translation, consider all this translation as somehow historical materials that's waiting for me to analyze, to find out why and how it happened. So just to think about all this translation activity as a historical event. So we want to know who's participated in this and how it comes into being like this. Also, yes, there's descriptive. I think most of my research, translation research, would be very, because in translation studies we have this descriptive translation study. So this is only for the purpose of this public talk. Some public talk is not very academic report from my research. So I make a little bit like comments and judgment to whether this is a good translation or a bad translation, but I would not really do that in my research. I just describe how it was translated and why it was translated in this way. This talk is not really what I've done quite a lot more deep research on. I just know all this knowledge, this information, but if I have time and I'm very interested to look into this final translation. So I would want to know who was the translator and why we want to translate this passage and in this way. And there's a reference from for some other sinologists. There's any relation between that and how he was translated, how this translation was made and why. Basically, I was explaining why there was this translation and it was translated in this way. And maybe a little bit we can learn from this translation or this historical events, activities of translations. Thank you.
Thank you. So, any other questions? Okay, if not, maybe, yes. This gentleman here.
Thank you, Professor Chi, for this very illuminating speech. And I personally find it very fascinating that you extended the definition of translation and put much importance on the context. Me personally, as a previously translation student, find it really illuminating that we can not only focus on the text itself, but also on the stories, on the real human beings that we can connect to. So I learned a lot from your emphasis on how we can feel how we can personally connect ourselves, connect our personal experience as translator, or as lovers for Chinese literature to those knowledges that we can pay our respect to. So my question would be, for us as students of translation and students of translation studies, how can we learn from those examples? How can we not only learn from their translating experiences, but also from their bravery into put themselves to those really strange contexts of Eastern culture. So how can we learn from them? What's so fascinating about their lives that you want to share with us? Okay.
Great, thank you very much. And a very profound question, I would say here. What we can learn from this sinologists, first thing, as I've just mentioned, that we can try to understand different culture with more open-mindedly or with more sympathetic attitude to that, just not to kind of dismiss difference as inferiority. Kind of we try to understand why this is different from me. don't say anything that is different from me is not good enough, that I'm the best. That's not the case, obviously not the case. And as a student of translation or a student of translation studies, I would say one thing I personally would also want to learn from them is also their hardworking. I think one of the reasons that they can produce all these translations, all these works, that they have no computers, internet, and cell phones in the 19th century. So all they can do is read books, Chinese books, previous language books, to learn the Chinese language and to try to do something for yourself. I think many of the translators, except for those who died very young, that's kind of unfortunate curse for translators of Hong you have to be in a very good health as well. I personally, also some of very accomplished translators as an artist is like Davis. He lives to almost 90-something years old. And also for Giles, again, 90-something years old. That's something really remarkable for the 19th century. So keeping good health, I think, could also help a lot with your academic achievements. And another thing, I think, to read their stories, I think you can probably learn that why they can learn Chinese language so quickly is that don't be afraid to communicate with Chinese people. In the 19th century, obviously, hundreds, thousands of foreign residents come to China, but not everybody can speak the Chinese language. Not everybody is a sinologist. So why can they translate Hong in this way? I read some of their stories, memoirs. One thing I've learned is that they always take every opportunity to communicate with the local Chinese people, so to enhance, to develop their language skills. So yes, I think these are the things, obvious things we can probably learn from these sinologists and translators. Thank you.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Thank you, indeed. So I guess it's time for to the end of this exhibition talk. So thank you very much for all of you, and also thank you for listening.